I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode 140 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional crime fiction. This week, we're talking about Bunco crimes, the value of investigative associations, retired cops returning to work for one last case, and a different kind of POV. So I am currently in Port Douglas, Australia, on the Coral Sea in the tropical far north of Queensland. But I spent the last several weeks in Melbourne, Australia. And while I was there, I spent several days on the set of a TV show that hired me as a consultant. Now, a non-disclosure agreement prevents me from talking about the show, but I want to talk about the technology that's in use in production these days. Tech that did not exist 5 years ago. I'm talking about LED volumes. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of green screen or chroma key, the green wall your local weatherman stands in front of on the local news. The same camera trick that made Superman appear to fly and your coworker appear to have a tidy home office on Zoom. Well, those green screens, even the giant Marvel Studios sound stages painted all green inside, are going the way of the dinosaur. I have seen the future, my friends, and it's called an LED volume. So what the heck is it? Well, imagine going to your local electronics store and buying hundreds and hundreds of the latest, biggest 8K television you can get your hands on. Now, using those 8K TVs, create a 30-foot wall that's U-shaped inside a giant empty soundstage. Then cover the ceiling with those TVs as well. That is an LED volume. Now, put a vehicle or a room or wherever you want to contain your actors, put that right in the center of it while running a 360-degree high-def video of your background, which could be driving down the Pacific Coast Highway or across a polar ice cap or any other scenery you can dream up, which means you can spend all day doing take after take for hours on end, repeating that perfect moment, the moment the sun sets over the horizon, the moment your character's car comes out of the tunnel on the westbound 10 freeway and the Santa Monica Pier and ocean come into view. No more having to trailer cars with actors in them, shutting down traffic, driving back to the start because someone messed up a line. You get to instantly reset between takes. This tech is amazing. You can film at night and then 2 takes later film in the high sun of the desert. This is deciding where on the horizon you want the sun to rise. This is having the real lights inside the dark tunnel reflect off of the windshield of the car and the actors' faces. This is having unparalleled control over a scene like never before. And this is only the beginning. As a story creator, you get to decide what kind of scene or world your character lives in. And now, bringing it to life on the screen is more possible than ever. So dream big and write big, my friends. I cannot wait to see what you create. Our first question this week comes from Chris Kratchman. Welcome back, Chris. Hey, Adam. First, let me congratulate you on your retirement. You definitely earned it. Thank you, Chris. Here's my question. In your latest podcast, episode 139, you mentioned that you were a member of the High Technology Crime Investigation Association. I found another association called the National Association of Bunco Investigations. I was thinking of having my detective character join that association. What kinds of perks and benefits would he get for joining that association? And how do you join these associations? Thanks for the help, Chris. Thanks for the question, Chris. I've belonged to well over a dozen of investigator associations over the years, as both a member and as leadership in some of those organizations. And they typically provide 2 things: education and networking. But before we get into that, let me quickly explain for the listeners what the heck Bunco even means. Bunco is an old school cop term that clearly continues to live on, but it's for con artist type crimes. And when we say con artist, con means confidence, not convict. So these are the grifters, the charmers, the snake oil salesmen that get you to part with your money in clever and convincing ways by earning your confidence in them. My wife and I just finished watching the Stephen Merchant comedy series, The Outlaws, about a bunch of Brits and one American sentenced to community service in England. The American is played by Christopher Walken. And when they need to run a con or a confidence game, Christopher Walken's character always has one up his sleeve with a clever old school name. And the list of cons and scams on the NABI, that National Association of Bunco Investigations website, really reminds me of those. I'll link to it in the show notes, which you can find at writersdetective.com/140, where you can see a list of dozens of common scams, some of which date back decades. A few have those clever nicknames, like the Texas Tornado or Texas Twist, but most of them are listed by the type of scam, like Venmo scam or phone scam or diversionary burglary. But the details of how these cons, scams, and frauds are run are listed on that website page. And hopefully this gets your story creation engine firing on all cylinders. So back to Chris's question about what the detectives get out of it. First and foremost, associations like this will usually have an annual training conference, which is a great way to get up to speed on the latest trends, learn about any new case law relevant to these types of investigations, and yes, networking. In the case of the Bunco Association, they have private sector partners attending these conferences as well, which can be vital in stopping these kinds of crimes. For instance, if you have an elder abuse suspect shuffling their victim into a bank to add their name to the elder's checking account, wouldn't it be great if the bank teller or the manager had been to a Bunco training conference? Those are the kind of partnerships that we look for. Beyond that, the networking between police agencies is tremendously important as well, as the bad guys are constantly on the move in these kinds of cases. So having a fellow detective in another city or state that you can reach out to, one that you've met at that conference, can often make things happen in an investigation much faster than a cold call to that faraway department. Now, in the case of the Bunco Investigators Association, they have an active email newsletter that will also alert the detectives assigned to these kinds of investigations to trends they're seeing around the region or around the country. This is obviously separate to the official bulletins the departments will send out for cases that they're actively looking to solve, but belonging to these organizations gives you a better understanding of what's going on elsewhere and what trends to expect in your jurisdiction. And lastly, when you've had this kind of additional training, expertise, and experts in the field to rely on for help, it means you can include this in your statement of expertise in any of your warrant affidavits that relate to Bunco crimes. So if I'm going to ask a judge for a search warrant, the judge is more likely to give weight to my opinions and conclusions at the end of my statement of probable cause. In a fraud case, when I can truthfully say under oath that I've attended specialized training on confidence scams, that I'm a member of the National Association of Bunco Investigators, that kind of thing, as opposed to just saying that my expertise is having attended a police academy and arresting a couple of shoplifters. And Chris's last question was, how do you join those associations? Most will have an online application process where you have to list your police department and your supervisor's contact info. But most of the agencies that I belong to really came about, or the membership, becoming a part of the membership really came about by signing up for an in-person training conference where paying the tuition usually covered a year's worth of membership dues for the organization. Our next question comes from Chris Moody, who writes, "Welcome back to podcasting regularly, Adam." Thank you, Chris. One semi-popular trope is the retired cop being pulled out of retirement because of that one case. Any way this would really happen? Great question, Chris. This is definitely a trope. But if it worked for Deckard and Blade Runner, I am not going to knock it. The reality is no, we are not going to get pulled out of retirement. We might get subpoenaed to testify in a case from when we were gainfully employed, but we are not going to be forced back to work a caseload or work a specific case other than that. Some agencies will allow us to voluntarily work part-time as extra help. The key thing here is that we have a maximum number of hours we're allowed to work in a fiscal year as extra help. If we go over that number, we jeopardize our retirement status. So doing the extra help thing means working for a straight hourly wage with zero benefits. It can be a great way to make some extra cash, but no one is going to force you to come back. The other part of the coming out of retirement trope is that the protagonist is, in quotes, the best at what they do. No different than the Rick Deckard Blade Runner, the best Blade Runner that ever was, right? But the truth is, no matter how amazing a Ninja Turtle, Navy SEAL, Ace Ventura, pet true detective he or she is, there is always another player ready to take your spot. I may have said this on the podcast before, but when I was working patrol at the ripe old age of 21 years old, I had a sergeant that said, "You love this department more than it loves you. If you wreck a unit tonight, there will be another one on the line by morning, and you are no different." He wasn't being cynical about how the department treats its officers. He's saying we are a tool to be used like any other, and we will be replaced eventually. As an author, I doubt this is what you want to hear me say about your precious protagonist, nor did I really want to hear that at the start of my career either, but it's the truth. The key thing to understand is that every police department is dealing with constant change. Staffing, equipment, laws, crime trends, everything is fluid. Your star detective is in the office this week, but for the next 2 months, she's sitting at the prosecutor's table in a first-degree murder trial. Another detective got injured. Another got promoted to sergeant. Patrol is short-staffed, so they need detectives to put their uniforms on and shag calls in a black and white. The way departments contend with constant change and the way we create officers and detectives who can go about their jobs without constant immediate supervision is through a training culture. Someone is always learning how to do the job well. And that's the way it should be. Wisdom is most beneficial when it's passed on. And we do so in law enforcement intentionally. We learn, we become proficient, and we share our knowledge and wisdom. But this career, as much as I love it, is not kind or gentle to us. If we are lucky enough to make it out the other end, and going back to the tool metaphor, a 20 to 30-year career means that no matter how sharp we were in our prime, a service retirement usually means we aren't the sharpest tool anymore. No, wait, that's not what I mean. You know what I mean. But you get my point, right? Point. That's a tip of the spear pun. What I'm saying is that when your protagonist is in retirement and gets called back to work like Deckard and Blade Runner, they are very, very likely past their prime, even if they won't admit it. And there is someone else in the department that is very much in their prime and up to speed on the latest laws and tactics and policies and the way we do things now. Not always the best ways or the safest ways, but the current ways things are done now. As a Generation X latchkey kid myself, I was viewed by those Vietnam veteran era of cops before me as part of the slacker generation. We, the young cops of the 1990s, viewed the old-timers as the dinosaurs that handed out a type of street justice that was no longer acceptable. Expectations of how cops are supposed to act change constantly, and it doesn't take long in the grand scheme of things for the world to move on and you to become the dinosaur. Now, I'm the dinosaur in the eyes of the millennials and certainly of Gen Z, with my sus tendency to look people in the eye when I'm talking to them as my way of communicating and not relying on GPS to know what street I'm on and just being able to shut up and do my job. But my days as the adrenaline-fueled protagonist are likely over, and I'm much more likely now to be the mentor, which I am wholeheartedly resisting because, as you know, the mentor almost always dies in the second act, and I don't want that to be my demise. But certainly think about whether or not you really need to bring that character in for one last case, and if you do, consider making this the opportunity to introduce a new protagonist and make that former protagonist their mentor, which is kind of what we're seeing in the Bosch books with Renee Ballard now as well. Michael Scott asked this in the Writer's Detective Facebook group. He writes, "Hi, I have another trope question. How frequent is it that homicide detectives use their own vehicles on the job? And/or is there a motor pool where they're issued a department-approved vehicle?" The short answer on using your own vehicle is no. But this immediately brought to mind Detective Riggs and Murtaugh in Murtaugh's Country Squire station wagon in Lethal Weapon. There are so many issues to contend with if you are in your personal vehicle, or POV, as we call it. Writers hear POV and they think point of view. A cop hears POV and we think personally owned vehicle. So yeah, using your POV creates so many issues to contend with, not the least of which is personal liability. In California, if I wreck my department-owned emergency vehicle, it does not affect my personal auto insurance policy. So imagine getting into a pursuit of your homicide suspect in your personal vehicle and crashing into an innocent driver on the road. That's no bueno. Most of my career, I had an unmarked detective unit assigned to me that I could take home. In my first few years, we shared vehicles that remained parked at our office. And that meant any call out started as a drive to the office to get in the work car and then drive out to the scene. So that was a delayed response time and more overtime. There typically are motor pools where we can check out a vehicle if we don't have one assigned, or if our normally assigned vehicle is in the repair shop. But that's most likely going to be a non-emergency vehicle that any department in the city, so think the water department or whatever, is also able to check out. It's not going to have lights or sirens or a police radio. You're going to need to bring your own portable radio in order to communicate. So you can make your character rough it like that if you really want them to. And checking out a vehicle from the motor pool usually requires a boss of some sort to sign off on it, as that's going to incur extra cost to the department. Because like I always say, it's not about the money, it's about the money. Which leads me to ask you, what are your questions? Send them to me, no matter how small the question, by going to writersdetective.com/ask. I'd also like to thank my Patreon patrons for sponsoring this episode, especially my Gold Shield patrons Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com, Cece Jameson from CeCeJameson.com, Larry Darter, Natalie Borelli, Craig Kingsman of CraigKingsman.com, Marco Carocari of MarcoCarocari.com, and Vicky McWilliams for their support, along with my Silver Cufflink and Coffee Club patrons. You can find links to all of the patrons supporting this episode in the show notes at writersdetective.com/140. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well.